listened to any of my art talks in the past, you may already be familiar with the fact that I live in the beautiful, multilingual city of Montreal. However, it might be less known that I was actually born in New Orleans, Louisiana. This has everything to do with my mother. Being the passionate fine artist she was, she fell deeply in love with New Orleans, the culture, and the people. She continues to love it that much to this very day, so much so that many of her paintings over the years have been based on New Orleans culture. It's for this very reason that back in 1975, when she was 8 months pregnant with me, that she decided on a whim to fly down to New Orleans, give birth to me. My mother's often told me the story of something remarkable that happened in New Orleans during those few weeks when she was waiting to go into labor. She got an unexpected knock on the door one day, and when she opened it, her neighbor unexpectedly lifted his white cat a foot away from her face without warning, asking if she could watch him for the weekend because he had to step out of town. She wasn't only surprised by the sudden gesture, but shocked by a feature that the cat had. The cat had two strikingly different color eyes, one dark black, one snowy blue. Her reaction was a mixture of surprise, followed by a wow when she saw the cat's face. However, she politely declined her neighbor's request and told him that she was most likely going to be heading to the hospital over the weekend to have me. A few days passed, and sure enough, she went into labor. So she and my father jumped in the car and headed to Hotel Dieu Hospital, a hospital that was sadly lost when Hurricane Katrina hit back in August of 2005. Now, the 56 hours of labor that she went through that almost cost her life is an epic story in and of itself. But in the end, out I came. The long and difficult delivery that she went through knocked her out for a full day. But when she awoke and asked to see me, the nurses came back and set me down on the bed on my tummy. Now, normally, newborn babies don't have the strength to lift their heads, but apparently, as far as my mother told me, I did a full push-up and stared right at her with a big, mean frown on my face. What also surprised her was a shocking feature of mine that wasn't actually unfamiliar to her. I had two uniquely colored eyes, one light blue and one dark brown, immediately reminding her of that white cat she had shoved in her face only days before. Although the frown was a feature that would disappear shortly after my birth, my eyes didn't. They remained different colors to this very day. Through most of my childhood, as far as I knew, I was the only person I knew who had this strange feature. It wasn't until I was around 11 years old when I first learned of someone else, a famous actor, who had the same feature, even more noticeable than myself. An actor who starred in one of my favorite films of all time as the Goblin King. If you haven't figured it out already, I'm talking about the movie Labyrinth. And of course, the actor I'm referring to is David Bowie. On January 10th, 2016, only weeks away from the time of this very recording, David Bowie, the famous actor, singer, and songwriter, passed away. As such, many past films and interviews were being played in his memory. My mother had watched one of these interviews, and while having a conversation with her, she mentioned something he had said during this interview to me. When Bowie was asked the question, "Do you ever copy anyone?" he answered without a moment's hesitation, "Of course I do. I copy people all the time." He went on to say, and I quote, "It doesn't mean that I flat out plagiarize others' work. Rather, I have a habit of finding strange, sometimes abstract connections between things I hear and fit them together into a new, original sound. Once that connection is made," he goes on to say, "I finally add that little bit of Bowie magic and an original song is born." Being a visual artist myself, this quote from David Bowie got me thinking about my own creative process, but I didn't dwell on the thought for too long. It wasn't until several weeks later, while listening to a radio show about marketing and advertising, that I made my own connection that is actually at the core of what today's talk is actually about. The subject of this particular radio show was about the differences between men and women, how we thought differently, and how our brains have evolved over the hundreds of thousands of years of our evolution. Although it was made clear very early on that men and women possessed the same number of brain cells, and we were equally intelligent, the physical makeup of our brains was slightly different. The most significant of these differences was the fact that men's brains tended to possess a higher proportion of gray matter, whereas women's had a higher proportion of white matter. As such, scientists claim that this is most likely at the core of some of our fundamental behavioral and personality differences. Because the larger men were tasked with hunting over long periods of time, and women were tasked with taking care of the fort back at home, our brains evolved to cater to those particular lifestyles. Over our 200,000 plus years of evolution, men's brains grew better suited for long-term, focused, and strategic single tasks, whereas women's brains were better suited for multiple peripheral tasks. This evolutionary trait in men and women continues to exist today, where men and women generally have a tendency to partake in activities that cater to these particular strengths. While men are generally more long-term goal-oriented, women generally take on a greater number of shorter tasks. However, in the best interest of today's topic, it might be important to make a clarification. These particular traits aren't exclusive to men or women. They're traits that men and women both possess, but in differing degrees, depending on their personal genetic makeup, their lifestyle, or even their choice. If we reflect back on what David Bowie said during his interview about his creative process, i.e. that he would intuitively create connections between seemingly abstract bits of information, it shouldn't take long for us to deduce that Bowie's creative process took advantage of the feminine part of his brain. When I turned that observation on myself, I realized that my creative painting process also very much resides in the feminine portion of my own mind. In fact, my mind lives in a constant quote-unquote law of attraction state, constantly receptive and ready to create mental synapses between different abstract bits of information. My mind naturally bridges these connections, and it's this very facet of my own personality that's at the core of my artistic creation, my sense of humor, my daddying style, and so much more. But this artistic trait is not exclusive to me at all. In fact, from most artists that I've met, studied, and followed over the last 40 years, it's quite apparent that most artists possess this trait. However, in differing degrees, depending on their particular artistic style. As much as I enjoy comparing myself to the great David Bowie, however, there is a fact that distinguishes us as visual artists in terms of our approach to the creative production. As an artist and teacher, I have noticed that this difference is very often very much a source of great frustration for many artists, and although these frustrations are more common in less experienced artists, professionals aren't entirely immune. Reflecting back on what Bowie said, it's important to reflect not only on what he said, but how he said it. Notice that there was zero hesitation, embarrassment, or guilt in his voice when he admitted to copying others. He wasn't guilty because he wasn't expected to be guilty. Take performance art or acting, for instance. It's quite clear that actors don't feel shame in copying others because copying is in essence what actors do. They copy people. In fact, if we think about it, the same can be said for any form of artistic expression: music, literature, dance, poetry, singing, or even cooking for that matter. Musicians aren't expected to invent new chords or measures or rhythms every time they write new music. Rather, they rearrange existing sounds and chords in new ways to create something new and unique. Cooks don't invent new food. They use original, combinations of ingredients to create refreshing and exciting new experiences. In fact, artists who chance traveling too far off the beaten path too early very often risk getting a poor response from their audience because their audience isn't ready for it yet. In the case of the visual arts, and by that I mean fine art, illustration, concept art, and in some cases design, this logic is often misplaced. As a teacher and online mentor, when a student is left to their own devices, regardless of how gifted they are at painting from observation, they often tend to abandon the reference and paint entirely from their heads. After days or even weeks struggling to achieve a painting that they can be proud of, they end up throwing their hands up in the air in frustration, and the letters of discouragement and anger start rolling in. It's at that point that I confront them with a reality check. I ask them if any reference was used to achieve that result, to which their answer in most cases is, well, no. When I ask why they decided to avoid using reference, it's only usually then that they open their mouths to respond. Then a realization stops them short. After a moment of bewilderment, they turn to me and respond, well, I'm not exactly sure why, to be honest. It's at that point that I usually smirk knowingly, and in my calm and collected and maybe a little tongue-in-cheek way, I go on to say, well, then, maybe that might be the next logical step. Now, as we all know, this problem isn't anything new. We've heard it a million times, but one has to ask why this issue continues to exist. And from my own observations, this habit has only grown worse over the years. Well, the answers we seek might lie in the masculine and feminine portions of our mind. As students, when seeking higher education, either in traditional schools or online, it wouldn't be considered intuitive to choose a teacher based on how masculine or feminine their creative process was. Well, at least, not consciously. In most cases, we're far more likely to choose a teacher based on their particular artistic style. To stop for a moment, however, now would be a good time to clarify something. Style is important when looking for a teacher, for obvious reasons. You aren't going to hire a mech designer to teach you how to paint fantasy creatures. However, you would be taking a huge risk with your time, money, and feelings of self-worth if you based your decisions solely on this fact. To give you an example, imagine this. Imagine that you're researching schools or mentors to help you reach that next level of artistic growth. And you're doing so because you're well aware that there are certain facets of your creative process that are frustrating and unclear. You might be highly organized and technically solid, but you get stuck when it comes to being original and creative. So, based purely on your love for somebody's artistic style, you sign up with their school. First day in, the teacher says, this week we're going to do 35 sketches using this technique, aiming to achieve this goal. In essence, they're using a very structurally rigid and uncreative process, which, if you've been paying attention so far, leans strongly towards the masculine or goal-oriented frame of thinking. After only completing 2 months out of the 6-month course, in a fit of total dissatisfaction, you snap your pencil in half and you call it quits. You feel no better off after all that hard work than you did before you walked in, and it's pretty clear to you that if you continue down this path, you'll find yourself even more frustrated. What you might do, and wrongly so, would be to blame the teacher or the school. You might accuse them of being quote-unquote crappy teachers. You'd share this argument with your fellow students, and they'd reply, I don't know what you're talking about. I love our teacher. Causing you to turn that frustration on yourself, maybe making you feel like the oddball dummy of the class. But the fault was neither yours, or the teacher's, or the school's. The fault was a lack of consideration of a very important fact about yourself and the teacher that, quite simply, didn't mesh. You were looking for a teacher that had a more feminine approach, someone who could connect you with your spontaneous mind, someone who could teach you how to be more receptive to subtle, abstract clues. The problem was that you never considered this to be an option, or, more importantly, an integral intellectual and creative connection with your teacher. Once you take the time to explore and break down the different facets of your own creative process, then start to discover when and how your masculine and feminine mind play dominant roles during your creation process. It's only really then that you can make clear and informed decisions that can have a positive and lasting impact on your artistic future. Otherwise, if you think about it, you truly are taking a shot in the dark. You're leaving that entire process to chance. Some are lucky and team up with a teacher that thinks exactly the same way they do. Others are left by the curbside and usually end up blaming themselves. I've mentioned this many times in the past. Surrounded by so many talented artists, it's very easy to lose sight of our own unique talent and our own particular way of thinking. Getting yourself, quote-unquote, into the zone is something we struggle with every day of our lives, and it's a skill that can take our entire life to master. Although finding inspiration in artists that we look up to is very important towards our growth, we have to learn where and how to draw the line between inspiration and discouraging distraction. Although narcissism is generally a derogatory remark, implying that, quote, someone is too self-absorbed and lacks empathy in others, a very honest and candid knowledge of who we are, and furthermore, embracing who we are as an individual, is at the core of our personal and artistic growth. Leonardo da Vinci himself said, and I quote, "There is no dominion greater or less than over oneself." It's for this very reason that we need to discover and understand the role that we must play in this community and how we can get the best from it. Are you the type who makes small cameo appearances to show some appreciation, steal a few valuable bits of inspiration, then retreat back into your private nook and mull over them to create your next unique masterpiece? Or are you the type to lay down a straight road ahead of you with all of your tools, plans, and aspirations for the next 10 pieces laid out, ready to be tackled in sequence? Or are you someone who plays on both sides of the fence, letting your mind wander off with careless abandon when seeking new ideas, but then buckling down and getting organized when crunch time hits? If we look throughout the course of history, there is seldom one set method that applies to everyone. Every famous artist and entrepreneur over the course of history has their own unique flow. And rest assured, it wasn't until that particular artist recognized and embraced their particular flow that greatness ensued. And David Bowie knew this all too well. He continued to write music and even released a new album only weeks before his death. His most iconic last song was Lazarus, a song where he very poetically describes his own very real and very imminent death. And I strongly encourage you to watch Lazarus online, not only because the words are telling, but because the images are as well. He lays down in a hospital bed with buttons symbolizing coins for the boatman over his eyes. You then see him, later on, sitting at his desk with a pen in his hand, deep in thought over his next song, gritting his teeth and grinding down on the page, desperate to get the last words out on time. He then has an epiphany and his face lights up. He slams his hand down and starts writing frantically, so much so that he continues to write straight off the side of his desk. But if you listen to the words, although they are very beautiful, evocative, and poetic, you might have a hard time making sense of them at certain points. They seem to fly off the handle and get a little weird. The reason why he wrote this way was for the same reason that he always wrote this way. His songs weren't literal masterpieces, they were visual and sensory ones. He didn't worry about making literal sense in his songs, rather paint pictures with words that evoked a strong emotional response. Even in his very last song, his last message to his audience, he had no desire to speak his last and most meaningful words. He had already discovered the most important ingredients of his art form many years before. He wasn't sharing his last words on life and death, rather his last feelings. David Bowie's art form was entirely and purely himself, because he embraced who he was and how he thought in its entirety, his qualities and his shortcomings. And his unbreaking sense of integrity continued to the very end, embracing his final breath as he did his entire life. As should you. I'm Adam Duff. Thanks for listening.